You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast produced by Veteran Strategies and featuring conversations with fascinating and impactful men and women who have shaped our world, our communities, and our history. My name is Robert Vane, Principal of Veteran Strategies, and your host for our discussion. You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Garmon Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and NFP, a national insurance broker with strong local content. Our podcast is featured on the All Indiana Podcast Network in partnership with Wish TV. You may find Leaders and Legends at allindianapodcastnetwork.com. Thinking of starting a podcast or need to host a public meeting? Let Leaders and Legends LLC be your partner as you look for new ways to communicate your message. Please contact Chris Spangle or me at leadersandlegends.net. And as always, all our podcast interviews are dedicated to the legacy and generosity of P.E. McAllister. Thank you for listening to the Leaders and Legends podcast. Today, our guest is best-selling author and acclaimed Ronald Reagan historian, Craig Shirley, making his second appearance on the podcast. He is the author of 11 books, including 6 on President Reagan and 2 on World War II. He and his wife worked for President Reagan in Washington in the 1980s. His new book, The Search for Reagan, The Appealing Intellectual Conservatism of Ronald Reagan, with a foreword by Mark Levin. How'd you pull that off? We'll have to ask him. Mr. Shirley, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
You bet. My pleasure. Good to be here.
Let's start with Mark Levin. He's obviously a hero to many people in the conservative movement for his unvarnished takes and insightful analysis. Have you guys been friends for a long time? And you said, hey, why don't you do me this favor?
As a matter of fact, we have been. He worked in the Reagan administration. He worked for different various agencies and ended up as chief of staff to Ed Meese when Ed Meese was Attorney General. And I was politically active. I worked in the Republican National Committee, and I ran an independent expenditure supporting Reagan's election in 80 and 84. And started my own firm in December of 84 after the re-election. Anyway, Mark and I met many years ago. We've been friends ever since.
What do you think that you and Mark combined bring to the conservative movement, the Republican Party in 2024?
I don't want to talk about myself, but I think that Mark brings an intellectualism to American conservatism and to the national political debate, something that's sorely missing by many people on the right. Many people on the right simply react to the left without making the case for American conservatism, for making the case for federalism, for making the case for less power to the national government, more power to the individual, more privacy, more dignity. All those aspects, all those arguments go into making American conservatism an attractive ideology as opposed to American liberalism, which is all about power, and they pretend it's about justice, but really it's about control. So I think that's what Mark brings, is that it's sorely missing intellectualism to the national political debate.
You have authored, as I mentioned just a few minutes ago, several books on Ronald Reagan, knew him, worked for him, worked with him. What made you think or decide that another book on the 40th president was warranted?
It's better than hanging around pool halls and on the streets, right? I'd written 10 books up to that point. I'd written 5 on Reagan. And there was still still an itch that I wanted to write a corrective about Reagan. And I wanted to refute the liberal lies about Reagan. And I wanted to delve into his intellectualism and his compassion. So those were basically the goals in writing The Search for Reagan. I deal with Reagan and and AIDS and Reagan and homosexuality and Reagan and reparations for Japanese Americans and Reagan and his intellect, Reagan and his compassion, and as I said, a corrective for the many liberal lies. Robert, one chapter I didn't include, and I wish I had, was Reagan and the homeless, because it's been falsely said many, many times that Reagan started the homeless crisis. That's entirely untrue. Is that the homeless were formerly inmates in American mental institutions. And
Deinstitutionalization. That's right.
ACLU went to court and said they're being held against their will. Their constitutional rights are being violated. So these nuts were turned out on the streets. So that's why mental institutions are empty in America today, and why bridges and sidewalks are filled with dirty, shoveled bums and derelicts and so-called homeless.
The interesting thing I thought when I read your book and then reflected back on the title, if anything, the ascent of Ronald Reagan in late 1970s and his election, his resounding election and re-election in 84, he was first elected in 80,
right,
was thought to be an anti-intellectual movement, that he was just a sleepy old man and he was bomb hungry and all those sorts of things. It was portrayed by Reagan's opponents, whomever they were, as anti-intellectualism and a step backwards. How do you take on that charge?
That's false, and it's ridiculous, and it's stupid. And it's made by people who are, in fact, anti-intellectual themselves. Even the Washington Post editorialized in 1980, saying that one thing refreshing about Reagan's campaign was that it brought a new intellectualism to the American political debate, and we certainly needed that. Look, ever since the New Deal, both parties had been big government parties. Democrats were, of course, a big government party, and the Republican Party was a Me Too government party. Democrats were for higher taxes and more government regulation. The Republicans were for less higher taxes, but higher taxes, and less government regulation, but still more government regulation. Nobody was making the argument, going back to the founding, that what is needed in America is a recognition that the individual is more important than the state. That privacy is one of the keys to intellectualism. Privacy, dignity, and leaving people alone is that this is all common sense. But I would argue that common sense is intellectualism. Is that this is something that's eluded the left because they're only interested in power. Let's face it. They look at the lawlessness of Governor Gretchen Whitmer. She just signed a bill in Michigan. Get this, believe it or not, making it illegal to count votes if there's a discrepancy discovered. She basically wrote a law that says if you obey the law, you're a lawbreaker, and if you're a lawbreaker, then you're obeying the law. We're through the looking glass. I mean, she is quite stupid. She's not very smart, but she is evil. She's totally twisted the meaning of free and fair elections to mean not free and fair, but closed and corrupt. That's what she wants. And why do you think Democrats want the border open? Why do you think Democrats want crime in the streets? Why do you think Democrats want high inflation? All means of bringing people to heel and herding them together in mass, and they're easier to control. What do you think they want? Drugs legalized or made more readily available? Is an opiate for the masses to keep them under control. That's what this is all about. It's about a struggle, and it's been going on since the time of Pontius Pilate and Jesus Christ, a struggle for the right to the dignity and privacy of the individual versus the corrupt elites. Pontius Pilate was a corrupt politician. He was from a wealthy family that was equally corrupt. And Jesus Christ was a threat to that system. He was a threat to Rome, and he was also a threat to the moneyed Jewish elites in Jerusalem. So you got the nexus together of Rome and the Jewish leaders who felt Christ was a threat to the established order, and that's why he was crucified. But take it down to 1775 and George Washington. And it was, again, the corrupt elites, meaning London, Great Britain, King George II and King George III, versus the Americans who were fighting for individual rights and religious freedom. That's one of the unwritten stories of the American Revolution. It was also a story about religious freedom, because the Church of England was the political arm of Great Britain. And the Church of England had Anglican churches all through the South, less so in the North. In Pennsylvania, they were Congregationalists, and William Penn had already brought religion to Pennsylvania. But through the South, Virginia southward, it was heavily Anglican. And the church collected taxes. They mandated church attendance. They actually hung several priests or several religious leaders who were preaching faith other than Church of England, the prescribed religion of Church of England. They crushed down on the individual. And I detailed that in my book about Mary Ball Washington. But so it was much, again, and that's what we have today, is that this election, I've compared, Robert, I'm sorry to go on at length like this, I beg your pardon, but I've compared this election to the election of 1828 and 1980. In 1828, you had the corrupt elites supporting John Quincy Adams versus the populace who were supporting Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson won. The people won. The election of 1980, again, the corrupt elites were supporting Jimmy Carter versus the populist conservative Ronald Reagan. Reagan won. This election also is shaping up as the corrupt elites in the image of Joe Biden and all he represents versus Donald Trump, who represents the American people.
Do you think in a situation like this, with new technology, with social media and all the tools for communications that we have now that we didn't have in 80, obviously didn't have in 1824 when John Quincy Adams stole the election from Andrew Jackson?
Target election, yes.
Or in 1828 when Jackson defeated Adams in the rematch. How much has technology played a role in being able to understand what's happening in today's political world?
It means everything. The ability to communicate. It's interesting you mentioned that, because in the First Amendment, when the founders were crafting the Bill of Rights to add to the Constitution, the First Amendment is mostly dominated by personal freedoms: freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, those types. And oddly jammed in there is the freedom of the press. Now, the founders and framers despised the pamphleteers and the broadsheets of the era. They saw them as a valuable ally of the American people against their government. And it worked for 200 years. John Adams imprisoned newspaper editors who displeased him or crossed his anti-sedition acts. Abraham Lincoln imprisoned newspaper editors who editorialized against the Civil War policies. Several editors in Baltimore were imprisoned by Lincoln. Woodrow Wilson, Franklin Roosevelt, and John Kennedy all bitterly complained about Republican editorial policies by Colonel McCormick with the Chicago Tribune,
yeah,
or the New York Herald, which had a Republican editorial policy, and Kennedy actually canceled the White House subscription in the New York Herald Tribune. But the point is, it was working. It was working. It was making the comfortable uncomfortable, which is a job, as the founders saw it, for the national media. That changed with the rise of Obama. The national media, which is always tilted left anyway, going back to the New Deal, but they were professionals. They were smitten with the idea of a handsome young black man being elected to the presidency, whether or not he was qualified or not, whether or not he had the credentials or not, whether or not he had anything other than he was a good-looking guy and he was black. And so the national media just circled the wagons and never questioned him, never questioned his many failings, never questioned his inexperience, nothing like that. And that's now carried over to Biden. And we saw it up until two Thursdays ago, when we saw it laid bare the lies of the national media, who have been covering up, obfuscating, and protecting Joe Biden for the last 3.5 years. We saw in real time the condition of our president, which is he's in very bad shape physically and mentally. It's not a question of him serving 4 years. It's a question of whether or not he can serve another 4 weeks or 4 months. So it's funny, too. I'll just say one other thing is that when Federal was 70, Alexander Hamilton wrote about a president having the energy and having the vigor to withstand the strains of being president of the United States. So going back, the founders were geniuses, and they foresaw that a president was required, it was necessary to have the strength, the physical, not just moral strength or intellectual strength, but also the physical strength to be president of the United States.
See some parallels in this coming election in 2024 to the one that happened 80 years ago, in the sense that obviously we're not in the middle of World War II. There are some differences. However, there are significant questions about Joe Biden's health, as there were significant questions about Franklin Roosevelt's health in 1944.
Yes.
Basically, the people who nominated Roosevelt and were around him knew he was never going to make it through a 4th term, which is one of the reasons why they kicked Henry Wallace off the ticket and installed Harry S. Truman. When Reagan ran in
Wallace was also an embarrassment because he was not vigorously in support of American might or American. He supported America winning the war, but he was tepid about it. He needed a centrist on the ticket. I'm sorry, I interrupted.
No, that's all right. I'm laughing, just saying I was trying to be generous is all. And then in 48, he runs for president himself.
Yes.
In that 4-way race. In 1980, Ronald Reagan, when he was elected, was 69. He turned 70 in between his inauguration in January of 80 and being shot in the chest on March 30th, 1980. How did Reagan play down the age issue when he was running for president and being elected?
That's a great question, Robert. Early in his campaign, John Sears, who was then Reagan's campaign manager, he's since passed away, made the mistake in 1979 of taking Reagan off the road. Reagan had been out there speaking and campaigning and testifying and all that for 40 years, going back to the 1940s. He was a very vigorous man. He was a very energetic man. He was, crisscrossed the country many times by plane. And of course, in 1979, things were a lot different than they are today. Is that long distance communication meant it was a lot different. Now you get on the internet and talk to someone in California in a heartbeat. But then we had a long distance phone call cost a lot of money. And really, the only efficient way to communicate was by mail. And then it might take a letter across the country. I don't know why I'm going down this cul-de-sac. But anyway, Reagan beat the age issue because it was a bugaboo for his campaign in the early days. Because they hadn't been out campaigning, because Sears was holding him back, because Reagan was the front runner. He didn't want to squander his lead. And Reagan lost the Iowa caucuses. And a big upset to George Bush in January 1980.
Right.
Fortunately, in those days, there were 5 weeks in between Iowa caucuses and the New Hampshire primary, which gave Reagan time to recover. And recover he did. He was campaigning 14, 16 hours a day, every day in New Hampshire. He was as planted in New Hampshire as a stout maple tree. One day he was out campaigning one of those 16-hour days, and the press bus that trailed him, the reporters hung up a sign at the end of the day, the big sign that said, "Free the Reagan 44." They were exhausted from a pace being set by a man twice their age. And that's really how they beat it, by being vigorous and saying things and doing things, and not being a sitting duck, not being a sitting target, but by moving constantly. And of course, he was always saying interesting things on tax cuts or on SDI. SDI was later, but tax cuts or federalism or so many issues. So he was always in the news. And one of the tricks to you keep people's out of the screw tape letters, keep people's attention focused on what's not important. It was focused on his age for a time, but he managed to get the people to focus on the things he was talking about and things he was doing instead of his age. So eventually the whole age issue faded.
You are listening to the Leaders and Legends podcast. Our guest today is New York Times best-selling author Craig Shirley. We are discussing his book, The Search for Reagan, The Appealing Intellectual Conservatism of Ronald Reagan. Let's talk domestic policy for a little bit. Obviously, anyone who studied the late 70s or was around then, I was born in 67, so I certainly remember the time period, remembers that the economy was in rough shape, and that's being very generous. What sort of intellectual ideas and partners did Ronald Reagan bring to the national scene, to the political debate, and to the philosophical debates of the late 1970s?
Historians sometimes talk about what they call the sunburst theory of history. You look at Vienna in the 1800s and look at all those brilliant composers that came out of Vienna in that 100-year, 80-year time frame, Beethoven and Bach and Schubert and Brahms, and just who were all concentrated together, all listening to other work, all inspiring each other to do new and further compositions and music, and it just it staggers the imagination how many great composers came out of that era. The same thing happened in the 1770s in Philadelphia. You take all those brilliant minds, Madison, right, and Franklin and Washington, and Jefferson wasn't there, but he's one of his brilliant mind. But Adams and all those others, just truly great thinkers. And then again, 200 years later, you had the conservative movement, which was, I was there. I saw it up close and personal. I was part of it. And you had the Heritage Foundation. You had all sorts of political organizations and think tanks, Cato,
sure,
all generating white papers, all generating new ideas on enterprise zones, on tax policy, on family policy, on national defense. High Frontier later would push SDI. So there was a critical mass of intellectualism with the conservative movement in the 1970s, and of course Reagan benefited from it, but he was also a great inspiration because he himself had his own ideas on how this country should operate and how government should operate and how freedom should operate and how individuals should operate. So that by 1980, he's a fully formed. By 1976, he wasn't fully formed. He had the national defense gig down, but he hadn't had the economic arguments down, nor the social issues down. But by 1980, it's because of the intellectual half of the conservative movement, Reagan has adopted all these issues. So he's a fully formed libertarian conservative, small L libertarian conservative by 1980. And so he has the answers to the questions that are being thrown about the nanny state and about too much government and about government regulation and about government taxation and about government pressing down on the individual and all those other things, is that he's got the correct intellectual answers.
But people said it couldn't be done. You had both his opponents in the Republican primary in 1980 saying, I hate to say voodoo economics, but that's the term that resonates when future President George H.W. Bush labeled Reagan's economic policies as such. The news media certainly didn't think it could be pulled off. And certainly the Democrats and his opponents didn't think that Reagan's kooky ideas about returning more money to the American people, they wouldn't work. This is the way it's going to be from now on. And we have to solve our problem within this dynamic. And President Reagan didn't buy into that, did he?
There are always revolutionaries that are denounced as heretics, whether it's Benjamin Franklin couldn't capture lightning in a bottle, or the Wright brothers will never fly, or Thomas Edison will never invent a light bulb that works, or the atom will never be split. There are always naysayers. The carping critics on the sideline, as Teddy Roosevelt wrote about in the arena, is that there are always those naysayers. And there's an anti-intellectualism associated with naysayers, because you know what? If you come up with new ideas that are not in their purview, they're not in their control, then they don't become important anymore. It's like a perfect example is Reagan and all of communism, Reagan and the Berlin Wall. Now, the neocons, Henry Kissinger, that whole crowd says the Soviet Union was a thing of permanence, the Berlin Wall was a thing of permanence, and we should just accept the fact that we're Sparta and Athens, and we're going to be at war with each other for forever. Reagan unveils a new idea, a revolutionary idea, an idea that scares the moneyed elites, which is we're going to transcend communism. We're going to consign communism to the ash bin of history. And so he sets about doing that. And he uses every means at his disposal, whether it's Radio Free Europe or Radio Marti or his speeches, his broadcasts, aiding and abetting the freedom movements in Czechoslovakia or Nicaragua or Afghanistan. He had Soviets, he had them, they didn't know what hit them. It's never been done to them before. He had them, their heads are spinning around. They didn't know what to do. That's why they're so desperate to get rid of SDI, because, again, it was a new idea. It was a new idea that a country could arm itself with a totally defensive system and no nuclear missile or no nuclear missile could ever penetrate it. And this scared the shit out of the Soviets because they believed we had the technology to accomplish it. And we just saw in Israel a couple of months ago, the technology does exist. You can, under the Iron Dome, you can shoot down missiles that are heading toward your country. Reagan was a revolutionary. The established order always viewed him as a suspect because he was never part of the establishment. He was always challenging the establishment.
Is it fair to say that Reagan rejected the bipolar world not only because of his study of the issues and the intellectual groupings around him, but also because of his faith, because of his belief in God and that good would prevail over evil? Is it? I don't know if I think it was pretty close into his presidency where he said, and I'm going to mangle this quote, Craig, so forgive me, his prediction or his policy on the Cold War: we win, they lose.
Yeah, that's what he told Dick Allen in 1979. Yeah, but he rejected it. Bipolar, one side is communism, the other side is freedom, and that they're a thing of permanence. He rejected that notion. He rejected the idea that people have to live in servitude and enslavement forever. Is that he rejected that in the Soviet republics. He's rejected that in the Warsaw Pact, and he certainly rejected that in the old Soviet Union. He was proven correct. History has proven him correct. Liberal historians still can't come to grips with it. Liberal historians still trash Reagan. Liberal historians still, and the New York Times this morning had yet another lie about Ronald Reagan. The New York Times always lies about Ronald Reagan. But they said that he was suffering from Alzheimer's in the last couple of years of his presidency, and his aides worked to cover it up. That's just a goddamn lie. He wasn't diagnosed with Alzheimer's until 6 years after he left the presidency. And if you can go on YouTube and look at any video of Reagan in 1988, he is articulate, he's smart, he's sharp. Yeah, you're not going to say sharp as a tack because then you're going to compare him to Joe Blow Biden. He is bright, he is articulate, he is not afflicted by Alzheimer's at all. As a matter of fact, his intellect actually deepened the older he got. Most men reach a point in their life where they become static. Their view of the world is static, usually about 40 years of age. They just accept and settle view of the world. Reagan wasn't like that. Reagan kept evolving. Reagan kept changing all through his life. He kept refining his ideology and his view of the individual. He really cherished the rights and the dignity and the privacy of the individual. You look at his speeches when he was president, how many times he mentions individuality.
Well, that's a key part of his movements and his actions, both, let's say, hard, some of them soft, maybe surreptitious, against the Soviets and communism, was their devaluing of the individual. And Reagan brought that back.
Yes, exactly. Absolutely. I couldn't have said it better, is that they did devalue the individual for the state. And Reagan, of course, had the opposite view, is that the individual is much more important. The individual transcends the state. And you touched on something earlier. You talked about his faith. And of course, his faith was very important to him. He was a born-again Christian, but he was very quiet about it. He didn't make a big deal about it. He was proud of his faith. He was proud of his religion. He was devout. And of course, what does the New Testament talk about? It talks about freedom, is what Christ is all about in the New Testament. And this is what passed through to Reagan, was that freedom comes from God. Freedom comes from inspiration of Jesus Christ, and not, as John Kennedy said, not from the hand of the state, but the generosity of God.
You are listening to the Leaders and Legends podcast. We are sponsored by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, Garmond Construction, the Union Station Hotel Crown Plaza at Union Station Hotel and Conference Center. Our guest today is Craig Shirley, author of The Search for Reagan, The Appealing Intellectual Conservatism of Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan was described by a man named Clark Clifford, who ended up being a convicted felon.
Yeah. That sums up everything you want to know about Clark Clifford.
You want me just to skip to the next question?
No, you know, an amiable dunce, I know. Said by an amiable crook.
Yeah, he was an amiable dunce. And people wrote books. I think Haynes Johnson's book is Sleepwalking Through History.
Yeah. I'm familiar with all of them.
The Democrat.
Robert, let me ask you one question. Mm-hmm. How many statues in America or in the world are there of Clark Clifford or Haynes Johnson? And how many statues are there of Ronald Reagan?
I would give, 0 for Haynes Johnson, who's just his career is predictable. Clark Clifford, I think, certainly had some strong political ability when he first started in the 40s and 50s, and
he got lucky in 48. He dined out on that for the rest of his life.
That's exactly right. And then I believe became Secretary of Defense.
He was for a short time at the end of the Johnson administration. Johnson thought he was going to solve the Vietnam War, and you know what? He was a typical Washington bureaucrat. He didn't do a damn thing.
But you had folks, and he isn't the only one, and the other person I mentioned, that consistently denigrated Ronald Reagan's intellectual ability. Do you think that had more to do with Ronald Reagan or just the overall attitude of the self-proclaimed elites about conservatism?
The overall attitude of the self-proclaimed elites about conservatism. Look, can't think of his name now. Of course, he's forgettable. Wrote a book in the late 40s about the intellectualism of liberalism.
Mm-hmm.
And he described conservatism at the time as a rash of irritable mental gestures. That's how liberals saw conservatives. They saw them as their intellectual inferiors, is that everybody knew government is good for you, and therefore more government was even better for you. The Republicans and Democrats agreed more government is better for you, and if you advocated anything else, you were just anti-intellectual. You didn't. The liberals had a favorite line: "You don't understand. You don't understand." How many times in my life have I heard that?
Exactly. And is it fair? Let's say I'm a Truman-esque liberal, not Henry Wallace, but let's say I'm Truman, or I'm an adherent of him back in that time. And I go, look, the government, if it didn't end the Great Depression, it certainly helped as we get closer to the 40s. 38 was obviously a double dip bad year. The government just won World War II. The government just split the atom. So why would it have been wrong, or at least misplaced, for someone to say, look, the United States government has accomplished all these things. Why shouldn't I worship at the altar of Washington, D.C.?
Because government never solved. You're right. Government did win World War II. But on the other hand, and government built the interstate highway system. Actually, taxpayer money, and then private contractors built the interstate highway system. The government produced public schools, which have been an abject failure. For every argument you can make for government, I can make 10 arguments against government. Government did not save John Kennedy. Government did not save Martin Luther King. Government did not save Robert Kennedy. Government did not win the Vietnam War. Government did not solve the oil crisis. Government could not solve the high inflation. And that was the basis of Reagan's argument, which is that, look, by the late 1970s, look, this is not working. This is not working. Creating a Department of Education to administer bad educational policies to American students is not really a good idea. When you have 12th graders who are still finger painting and can't read can't diagram a simple sentence, something is terribly wrong. But of course, the liberal infrastructure, the NEA, they control the levers of power. And of course, as Albert Shanker once said, when he was head of the American Federation of Teachers, and he was once asked, he says, why doesn't your union care more about students? And he said, when students learn to vote, then we'll care about them. His union was for the teachers, just as the NEA is today. The NEA doesn't give a damn about children. Anything they say to the contrary is a lie. And the proof is how bad is public education in America. That's why parents are fleeing and going to parochial schools or homeschooling or private school, while they're fleeing public education. I got a granddaughter, and I'll be damned if she ever sets one foot into a public school. There's a private Christian school down the road here. That's where she's going. It's K through 12. That's where she's going.
Did in his lifetime, or let's say before he ended his presidency, he didn't end it, before it ended on January 20th, 1989. Do you get the sense that Ronald Reagan was intellectually satisfied at what his policies wrought and what he was able to overcome?
Reagan was a very proud man. By the way, the liberal I was trying to think of earlier, his name was Lionel Trilling. He wrote a book.
Yeah, heard of him.
He wrote a book called The Liberal Imagination, in which he described conservatism as just a rash of irritable mental gestures, which is interesting because he died in the 70s just as liberalism was fading and American conservatism was ascending. He was a very proud man, but he was also a modest man. I only saw it once did he stick out his chest and say, hey, look, we did a pretty good job. And that was his farewell address in January of 1989, which has to go down. It's probably the most significant presidential farewell address since Dwight Eisenhower, and before that, George Washington. Both of them were important policies. Both warned about the concentration of power, is that Washington did, as far as government is a wonderful, a terrible master like fire, but a wonderful servant. And then Eisenhower warned about the military-industrial complex coming to dominate American society. Again, too much concentration of power. Reagan's speech wasn't so ideological, but it was philosophical. And it talked about the importance of education, the importance of learning in the home. And in that speech, he talked about the Reagan Revolution. And he talked about the things that had been accomplished. And he said, we weren't just here marking time, we were accomplishing things. And he said toward the end, he says, not bad at all.
That's right.
About the many accomplishments of the Reagan Revolution. So that was one of the few times that I really saw him just stick out his chest a little bit and say, hey, look what we did. Otherwise, he was pretty modest about those things. He would usually say, the people did it. I didn't do it. Even in his farewell address, he said, these great ideas that came from my brow sprung from the American people.
You mentioned something a few minutes ago, and I want to go back to it. There's a recent poll, maybe the most recent poll, that they do on by historians and asking historians about ranking the presidents. And I had Talmadge Boston on the Leaders and Legends podcast, and we talked a little bit about it because Andrew Jackson was always in the top 10, and now he's suffered. And Woodrow Wilson was always in the top 10, sometimes top 5, and now he's plummeted. And people like Eisenhower.
I would agree with. Wilson was a racist.
Absolutely.
And the League of Nations was a disaster. And World War II, we never should have entered World War II. We had no business fighting in Europe. It was not our fight. It was not our war. He was pretty much of a disaster as president of the United States. I would not rank him I would rank him in the bottom 5th of all American presidents. Then
you have, for example, Ulysses S. Grant isn't rising up into the top 10, but he's clearly doing more, or doing better.
Despite the corruption of his presidency, he did do some very good things as far as railroads and as far as race relations. And he did continue the harsh policies toward the South, Reconstruction, which is unfortunate. But Grant was a good president, better than people thought.
And Dwight Eisenhower probably is the person who's reputation or rankings has changed most for the better.
Absolutely.
But in this survey, the one thing that caught my eye more than anything else wasn't who was up and who was down, but these historians, when they had to rank or say who was this president, who was that president. And I know this is going to get your blood boiling, so
I know all about it. Go ahead, Robert.
This survey said that Reagan was the luckiest president, and he has been tarred, and I think that's the right verb, with that description since 1980. Why?
Yeah. Okay. Well, yeah. Lucky thing he got shot in the chest and almost went into shock and lost half of the blood in his body and almost died. That was a lucky thing, wasn't it?
But they can't seem to. The point is that when I looked at it and shook my head, was every once in a while, you just have to look in the mirror, or you have to just go, look, this guy was underestimated. We overestimated his opponents and this and that. And they clearly didn't agree with his policies. And the fact that his policies had a net positive effect on Americans and Americans' history and our fortunes, they can't just say, I thought all this was going to be jacked up. I still didn't agree with most of it, but there are certain things you can't deny. And you're in the PR world. And I always tell my clients, never deny the obvious. It just, you lose all credibility. Go ahead, please.
That survey has no credibility. Now, let me let you in on a secret, is that I used to participate in that survey every year until they discovered I was a conservative, because the top 4 presidents I rated were in order: George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, Franklin Roosevelt, and Ronald Reagan. Because A, they freed or saved many people, and B, they left their country a better place than when they found it. And I think that is a great criteria for a president, is that they leave their country better than they found it, and they freed or saved many people. I think those are the two preeminent criteria for a president. Is that, but when they discovered I was conservative, or that I was outspoken conservative, they stopped asking me. Now, I've written 11 books on history: American political history, American war history, American presidential history. I've written about FDR. I've written about George Washington. I've written about Ronald Reagan. And yet they don't ask me anymore, because it's a rigged game. They only ask liberals who one time wrote a white paper on Harry Truman or something, and they include them. But it's a rigged crap game. The survey is only for lefties. Look, if you got me and Paul Kengor and Stephen Hayward and Karen Skinner and Paul Johnson and a number of other conservative historians, you'd get far different results. And we probably should do our own, because the left has created this, whether it's academia or Hollywood, they don't want conservative ideas. They don't want conservative opinion. They want to stifle it. They want to censor it.
I noticed you switched from conservative to outspoken conservative. As long as you sit there and hush your little mouth, that's one thing.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly right.
Last question for you, and thank you for giving us some more of your time. I enjoy your writings
Robert.
very much.
My pleasure.
Is there an issue? Let's take the gigantic ones that were part of the 80 campaign. So, Get America Moving Again, stagflation, the Brezhnev Doctrine, all of that.
Soviets on the march.
Yeah, everywhere. Horn of Africa, list goes on and on.
Afghanistan.
Is there a single issue that the media and the elites have gotten more wrong when it comes to Ronald Reagan than the fight against AIDS?
That was a whole chapter. In fact, it was 2 chapters in my book, The Search for Reagan. By the way, The Search for Reagan, the title, I thought you were going to ask me about this, but I'll answer it, is that Churchill's biographer, now it flew out of my head, Martin Gilbert. Yes, thank you very much. Martin Gilbert wrote a book. One of his books, it was called In Search of Churchill. Mm-hmm. And so that became the inspiration for the title of my book, Search for Reagan. I wanted to explore his intellectualism and his compassion. But the left has promoted a narrative that Reagan caused many gay men to die because he turned his back on it. And we've seen it in movies, and we've seen it in false narratives. in that Reagan turned his back on the whole AIDS crisis, which is totally and utterly untrue. AIDS was known by 1981, but it was not understood. It was thought that hemophiliacs got it and Haitians got it. It wasn't until about 82, 83 that people began to understand that it was a disease, it was an infection affecting gay men. And Reagan immediately devoted millions of dollars. They first started on behavior. Is that risky behavior is going to lead to you getting AIDS and bathhouses, things like that, which is a worthy goal. I remember World War II, they used to have posters of telling men to avoid loose women for they didn't want to get BD. So they've tried to affect behavior many times, and so the government tried to tell gay men is watch yourself, be careful, watch your step. But simultaneously, millions and millions of dollars was devoted to research, finding either a vaccine or a cure for AIDS. And Everett Koop, who was then Surgeon General, who was appointed by Ronald Reagan, was leading the charge. He was the one who was sounding the alarm. And of course, Reagan was right there with him. And don't forget, too, is that Reagan was in Hollywood Babylon, where there were a lot of homosexuals there. And they thrived there. They thrived there as actors or actresses or set designers or clothing designers or whatever. But they were well represented in the entertainment community. So Reagan had a lot of friends going back to the 40s who were homosexual. Reagan was one of the most tolerant, understanding presidents we've ever had. Most understanding presidents we ever had. When they also didn't. So Reagan devoted millions of dollars to research, and then after he became president, he and Mrs. Reagan raised a lot of money for the Pediatric AIDS Foundation. Mm-hmm. When the actor Paul Glassner's wife contracted AIDS through a blood transfusion, two of the people they heard from soonest were Ronald and Nancy Reagan, and reaching out to them to offer their condolences, offer their prayers, offer their advice, offer their assistance. And they continued, and Paul Glassner, as his wife got sicker, continued to hear from the Reagans. So it is a lie of the left, spun by the left, that Reagan lacked compassion where gay men were concerned. He was all compassion.
I said last question was final question, but please indulge me for one more. Who do you think in 2024, it's July of 2024, there's been some pretty significant political events in the last, let's say, month. The whole year has been a political sort of, I'm not going to say a head scratcher, but I'll just say that it's interesting how some things are seen as inevitable, but may not be. Other things are seen as, let's stop the inevitable, and it can't be stopped. And now here we are in summer of 2024. Who do you think in the conservative movement, doesn't even have to be a candidate, so it doesn't have to be Donald Trump, who do you think in the conservative movement these days, maybe not the best example of Reagan's intellectual conservatism, but 3 or 4 names?
Senator Tim Scott, Governor Ron DeSantis, Vivek Ramaswamy. The Speaker, Johnson, is an extremely bright man and embodies the best of Reaganism. Look, let's face it, is that Reaganism is thick through the Republican Party. Robert, I'm glad you raised this. Reagan brought a new set of issues to the Republican Party, and that issue cluster is still the glue, what is holding the party together. Federalism, pro-life, less taxes, more freedom, less government, anti-communism. All the issues that Reagan brought to the forefront in the 1980 campaign still predominate in the Republican Party today, because people have forgotten. Maybe you haven't, but people have forgotten, is that before 1980, the Republican Party was sometimes for high tariffs, sometimes for free trade, sometimes for war, sometimes for peace. It was sometimes for high taxes, sometimes. In 1970, Senator Ted Kennedy and Senator Walter Mondale said, the way to stimulate the American economy is through massive middle-class tax cuts. And the Nixon administration said, no, We're not going to cut taxes on the middle class. We're going to engage in massive federal spending to prime the pump and get the economy going. It's a complete role reversal. We know, going back to Smoot-Hawley, the Republican Party was once for high tariffs, and then Reagan was a free trader, North American Free Trade Agreement, which was to bind together the Western Hemisphere against Soviet communism, which was a worthy and wonderful goal. And now the party is back toward high tariffs, especially when it comes to China, which I'm in favor of, by the way. I'm generally in favor of free trade, but punitive against our enemies, yes. But the party, from the point that the party from 1854, sometimes it was very progressive on civil rights, other times it was less progressive. Sometimes it was for this issue. That from 1954 up until 1980, it switched positions on issues, a number of issues many times. In 1980, Reagan brings a new cluster of issues to the Republican Party, which still predominate in the Republican Party today. Really, what has changed now? What has changed? Nothing really. The party was pro-life in 1980. It's pro-life today. The party was for tax cuts as a means of empowering the individual, and that's one thing too. Robert, is I was standing with Reagan, who was at a CPAC in the early 1980s, and I was standing off the side. He was talking with a group of conservatives. They were talking about the proposed Kemp-Roth tax cuts. And he said, yeah, it's to stimulate the economy. It's supposed to do all those things. And he said, but it's really about giving power back to the individual. From the 1930s up until the 1980s, Reagan knew power can neither be created nor destroyed. It can only be moved around. And from the 1930s up until 1980, power had been steadily moving away from the individual and toward the national government, in the form of higher taxes, in the form of speech regulation, in the form of movement regulation. There were all these different regulations that the government was instilling on the American people, so that by 1980, their freedom wasn't nearly what it was, say, in 1925. And Reagan wanted to undo that. Reagan wanted to send power away from the national government, back to the individual in the states and localities. And that's what really cutting taxes was about, which was about taking power away from the national government and giving it back to the individual.
You have been listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Garmon Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at historic Union Station, and the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn. As always, all our podcast interviews are dedicated to the legacy and generosity of P.E. McAllister. Our guest today has been best-selling author Craig Shirley. We've been discussing his book and the ramifications of his book, The Search for Reagan, The Appealing Intellectual Conservatism of Ronald Reagan. Mr. Shirley, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
My pleasure.
And do us all a favor.
Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for inviting me.
Absolutely. Do us all a favor and keep writing.
I'm going to do my best. I'm working on a book right now about the Trump 2024 campaign. But I'm working on a book about Billy Sunday and also a book about Bojangles.
Come back on the podcast. We'd love to talk to you.
Thank you very much. I look forward to it.
Thank you very much for listening to Leaders and Legends, brought to you by Veteran Strategies Incorporated. If you want to contact us about this program or our menu of public relations services, please send us an email at robert@veteranstrategies.com. That's robert@veteranstrategies.com.